Hello, Professor Rashidi. My name is Deni Vojnikovic, and for my project 2, I decided to do a slight modification to the packaging of a drink that I frequently have, known as Cedevita. So getting a little bit into the kind of what and how of this project, Cedevita is a drink created in the 1960s in Croatia. My parents were actually Bosnian, and as a result, in addition, I have some cousins in Croatia, but growing up, I drank Cedevita a ton because it was a very common cheap drink in the Balkan states, and then coming over to the U.S., it's kind of a thing that we've still kept from our origin. But getting into Cedevita itself, it is a instant vitamin drink, which is essentially to say it comes in a container as powder. You put that powder into water and mix it, and it'll become the drink of Cedevita. Cedevita also comes in a bunch of different varieties. The primary one we'll be talking about is the 2.5 liter and kind of by extension 6 liter canisters, but it also comes as a small tab to be sold in restaurants and as a portable beverage, as well as a large 11.5 liter bag. Getting into the actual problem I have with Cedevita, it's something I kind of like to call idle clumping, which is that when I don't use the Cedevita for a couple days and it just sits on its own, there's this weird phenomenon that happens where the particles of Cedevita dust will start to clump together into basically just one big rock in the center. And that becomes a problem because when you're pouring Cedevita, the actual hole of it, the exit point for the dust, is relatively small. So as soon as you try to pour that Cedevita down, you're going to get blocked off by this, you're just going to get blocked by the rock, and then the flow completely stops. And then when you're trying to break the rock, there's really only two solutions. And you can open up the canister and break the rock with your hand, or maybe with a tool, grab a spoon or a fork and try to break it. Or alternatively, you can keep the canister closed and try to shake it, and just shake it enough until the clump breaks. But the problem with both of those is one, if you're using your hands or you're using some kind of tool, now that's some separate thing you need to clean. It makes the process of making Cedevita just kind of needlessly long because you're trying to break up this clump. Or the alternative of trying to shake it until it breaks, the top of the Cedevita lid is so smooth that when the rock hits it, kind of best thing you've got is maybe the rock breaks in half. But then even if the rock breaks in half, it's usually still large enough that it still gets caught in the hole and makes it harder for the Cedevita to flow. Switching over to a full camera, just so you can kind of get a better gist of this, I actually have all of my Cedevita products with me as a way to kind of improve the visual. And as you can see with this one, this was used in the previous reference photos along with its lid. It still currently has that rock. It's quite difficult to show on the camera, but the rock has become absolutely enormous and would absolutely get in the way of the canister. And just as a little bit of a demonstration here, I actually have one of my own cups. I have the Cedevita. I can attempt to pour it. We'll see how effective it actually is with the rock inside of it, where it's I will get a little bit to fall out, and then as you can kind of see in the canister, the rock is there, and it's okay, I can maybe shake it, but it's I can only get out so much dust from this at a time. So most of the time what I do, and hopefully this will actually visually show kind of well, is I will just start to shake the Cedevita, and sometimes it does work. In this case, I got a little bit lucky, and the rock immediately dissipated. But sometimes what will happen is I shake the canister and then the rock will just split in half. And then it's okay, that's progress, but also half of it is still enough to screw with the container. But just to complete this, because luckily it did happen to go relatively smooth, add a little bit more to it. And of course some water to top it off. This is so hard to do around my microphone, apologies, but I wanted to do it in kind of a fun way. Water on top. Whoa, Cedevita, like magic or something like that. But yeah, that's the core problem I have, is now you'll have these individual clumps, and I can actually check. I have additional copies of Cedevita. These are different flavors. And in addition, you'll also notice this one's kind of smaller. On this little right side, you can see a small clump. but it's constantly present because anytime the Cedevita is set to rest, you'll get these giant clumps. This one is a particularly bad case where you can see, it's hard to see because of the dust, unfortunately, but it's just over time you'll get a bunch of these little clumps, and it's just this additional thing you need to solve. It's just this additional problem to have. Now, getting into my actual proposed solution, I went with kind of the simplest thing I could think of, and that's just increasing the amount of like contact and damage to the clump with shaking. I think currently shaking is kind of the simplest way to do it. Taking out like a spoon or a fork to break it off just kind of makes it too many steps. And like shaking's really nice, but you do have this risk of like, cool, well, I just made 2 really big clumps instead of 1, and you have the same problem. So to kind of minimize the chance of that and still use shaking as like the main way to break up these idle clumps, I just introduced a bunch of spikes. So now when you shake it, instead of having like one big surface it makes contact with, it makes contact with like several spikes at a time. And then as it gets jabbed by each of these spikes, those are going to introduce cracks. Those cracks propagate. And now every time these clumps break up, they're going to break up into a lot more pieces. It's a lot less likely that it's going to break in half. And then going from there to the manufacturing, in my research, I couldn't find the specific material that is used in the construction of Cedevita canisters. However, I assume it's most likely a high-density polyethylene, as in my research, it seems like that's a very common material used in food containers, just because it's like a relatively stiff, non-reactive plastic that is very versatile and can be dyed into whatever color you need it to be. And then in addition to that, the method is likely just an injection mold using the polyethylene. I think that's probably the simplest way to go about it. It's not necessary to like mold or forge or it's not necessary to like cast or forge anything. The plastic should be flexible enough when it's molten to just go into a mold of this like cap design. And in addition, just to specify, the spikes themselves are 1.5 millimeters on both sides, and then they rise up 1 millimeter in height. I think in terms of kind of additional comments and concerns, I do believe there is maybe a better option of working with fewer spikes that are higher to kind of introduce a introduce a way to make way stronger cracks. I think the only consideration was like in terms of safety, I would prefer to keep them small, as that would prevent anyone from accidentally harming themselves with it if they ever did like open up the canister and mess around with it. In addition, I think there might be some concerns with injection molding it because the spikes are so small. However, in the research I've done, it hasn't, other examples I've seen haven't been particularly difficult. It appears to not be a problem, but it may be a concern. I just do not have enough personal experience with injection molding to know if it's necessarily better. I'm sure working with fewer spikes that are larger would be a lot more, if this is a problem, fewer spikes that are larger would most likely be more successful. But those are just kind of potential thoughts to keep in mind. And then finally, in terms of citations, the only real one that was necessary for the presentation was Cedevita.com itself, where they explain a little bit of their own history, as well as I used the various pictures of the products that were provided in Cedevita.com. But other than that, the presentation is finished. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.